Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. This week, with the hot temperatures we've been having and the noticeable lack of rainfall, we wanted to speak to renowned fishery scientist Ken Whelan, who gave a talk at the recent Irish Spring Angling Fair called Trout in Hot Water. Ken details the impact and consequences of rising temperatures on our freshwater fish as well as their food sources, and he challenges anglers to start thinking and adapting to the changing habit on waters that we are going to be seeing in the future. As always with Ken, he's got some thought-provoking and fascinating insights well worth listening to.
The first time I really noticed this was probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And on your show some years ago, myself and George McGrath, we talked about what we had both observed. So I'd been watching this little lake in East Galway called Loch Calla. And, incredibly, I used to fish in the 60s with my dad and my brother. And at that stage, even midsummer, 3/4 of the shore was absolutely accessible. And I've seen the plants each year creep and creep and creep. And George had seen exactly the same on the shore in terms of the stretches of rivers that he fishes. And that was the first real grab that caught me and said, you should start looking at this. And then I realized that this was more than likely linked to temperature. And there was probably a close link as well in terms of water clarity, because we were hearing so much about zebra mussel and how clear the lakes were. And since then, I've had a very keen focus on this whole idea of temperature increases and temperature rises. And just quite recently, a young scientist I was working with, out of the blue, asked me a really pertinent question and said to me, when you started to work as a young biologist, would you have even thought of a river temperature of 25 degrees? And I actually had to admit, I would never have even dreamt that that could be the case. And talking about 29.5 degrees, as we'll get onto in a few minutes, was just a fairy tale. And I mean, that is now what we're actually facing into.
These numbers that you're saying that were so off the charts are now becoming more likely to happen. And that's the scary thing about all this.
Yeah, it really is. I think so. And it's not as if this is going to happen immediately and we're going to see like everything in sight roasting and the lakes and rivers disappearing. The really concerning thing is that it's creeping up on us. It's creeping up slowly, because it was when that young lady asked me the question about the temperatures I would have seen and would have expected as a young biologist, I realized that I was getting used to it. I was getting used to this idea that my trout were actually now at a stage where they were edging up towards the limit of their tolerance in terms of the temperature. And let's remember, it's not just the fish themselves. The whole thing is going to be really variable. It's going to be quite complex. But as you both know, I'm really interested in my invertebrates. I was originally an entomologist, and I don't tell people that. I keep it quiet because people think I'm a salmon biologist. But fundamentally, I'm an entomologist and interested in all that biology of these invertebrates and the interaction of the invertebrates with the environment. And when you think of how adaptable some of these insects are, other insects then would be cold water tolerant, a bit like our fish. So we're going to see all these changes, and all of these changes are going to relate directly back to our angling. And I think that's what makes it really interesting. That was the point I was trying to get across at NEDS, that let's not keep a narrow focus on this. Let's look at it in a positive sense as well. How can we adapt so that we as anglers are ready for the changes that are coming? And we're not out there like headless chickens in 10 years' time, wondering why a particular, maybe Lake Olives have disappeared or whatever. And suddenly you're getting all these huge, huge hatches of one particular type of caddis or whatever. And that's likely the sort of changes that we're actually going to see. And certainly the other thing that I'm becoming more and more keen on is the idea of groups actually monitoring their own bays. I think that's really important, or monitoring their own rivers. A huge amount of self-interest in this. We tend to think of it constantly in terms of kind of water quality. And obviously it'll feed back into that. But I think in terms of understanding for our sport's sake, understanding what's happening and adapting to that in terms of possibly new tyings, possibly looking at new patterns, hours that we might fish. I think all of this is all knitted in together. And I think it makes it a really interesting subject to debate and to discuss.
Just remind us, Ken, what are the optimum conditions for brown trout to survive and thrive in?
I'm no expert in this area. So what I did for the talk was, and just to give full credit to IFI in terms of the job they've done over recent years, the young scientists there have done a fantastic job in terms of the monitoring system that they've actually put in place. I think it's 12 catchments that they have now, and they're monitoring them in an extraordinarily thorough way. So they were kind enough to give me unpublished, verified data for 2023, because that was a particularly warm year. And what they found, for example, in the context of the Moy, the maximum temperature they found was 29.1. So 29.1 would be at a situation where salmon, for example, would be stressed at kind of 23 and probably will die at around 33. Now, having said that, I can't emphasize enough, there's an awful lot of different factors involved here in terms of how it will affect the fish. You haven't just got the temperature, you've also got oxygen levels, you've got cover, you've got all these different ingredients, but roughly you're looking at for salmon 23, 33. And in terms of brown trout, they'll get stressed around the same temperature, but surprisingly, they'll actually cave in, according to the experiments, at about 30 degrees. So certainly, 29.1 is really something that no small trout or salmon wants to even think about. And certainly the rest of the fish that are in the water, apart from the coarse fish, they're going to be quite uncomfortable at that rate as well.
Can I just ask something there, Ken, though? Is there a difference between running water and still water?
Yes, very much so. And I think most of these temperatures, if not all of them, would probably have been experiments that would have been done in relation to running water. Right. And I think certainly you and I have talked about this before. I think the lake systems are really so subtle in terms of the stratification you can get in a lake. So if you have very, very warm temperatures in the lake, it's very, very calm, you're going to get this layering in the lake. So the temperature at the bottom might very well be much cooler than it would be at the surface. And that's a big advantage. The other thing that IFI found, which I thought was really interesting, and it supports completely my rant about drainage for the last 40 years, they found in the rivers that were drained that they were much more susceptible to these sort of peak temperatures. And the rivers that weren't seeing these peak temperatures were the spring-fed limestone rivers, which left on their own, a bit like the chalk streams in England that I was fishing recently. They're going to have a much more consistent temperature. They have a natural guard against these particular problems. But, I was thinking when Lord Henry Mount Charles died there the other day, I was very involved in trying to see, could we block or minimize the drainage on the Boyne? Because the Boyne was one of the last big drainage schemes that took place at a time when we knew exactly the consequences of what was happening. And to think of the damage that was done to that river in the context of drainage, that's now making it a lot more susceptible to the effects of climate change than would have been the case in the past. Nature had inbuilt into a lot of these systems the ability to be able to deal with some of these extremes, and we've carefully paid a fortune to get those out of there, get rid of them. And certainly that's the big advantage of the lakes, is the fact that I think there's much more resilience, even at this stage, probably built into the lakes.
And come here, just what are the safeguards that exist in a river that hasn't been drained?
So the thing is that the rivers that aren't being drained, basically what you have is you've got more pools. So you haven't got shallow water, you've deeper pools, you've got the meanders, you have a situation where more than likely you have a lot more springs coming in, not just the springs that you would see feeding the small streams, but there's a lot of other underground streams that as you walk riverbanks, you'll find these wet patches. You might hear a little dribble of water or whatever. I've actually seen a situation, for example, in the South Esk in Scotland, where in one particular beat where the springs enter the pool, I happened to be there during the drought. I seem to go salmon fishing in droughts all the time. But I was there during the drought, and the salmon actually had their heads into the riverbank. They were lying, if you like, across the river rather than upstream or downstream, with their heads stuck into these little areas where the pool, well oxygenated water was coming down. And that particular river hadn't been drained or touched at any stage. And the owner was telling me that was always well known. And I saw that in Canada as well, in the Miramichi. So all of these underwater features that have been there forever, and we ignorantly, really dealt them a dreadful blow in the past. We're now suffering as a consequence of them not being there.
I remember one of the last interviews did with Peter O'Reilly, and I'll never forget it. He was like incandescent when he was talking about the Boyne and the drainage that was going on there. You know, he was just like, you know, and like you said, Ken, like that, you know, the science was known. And the criminals, like, you know, the language, he was, and you know, you can understand
Peter.
why. Yeah, but you can
Yeah.
understand why, like his
Yeah.
home river, like, you know.
But it's gas, and we were discussing before we started recording, and we said, "Oh my God, there's probably another podcast in this." But the cultural significance of the Boyne
Yeah.
to Ireland, not
Yes.
just Irish fishing, to you know,
The
to
Irish
us,
nation.
the Irish nation. That's it. Yeah, and yeah.
It's, yeah,
It's
unbelievable.
It's a sin.
Like,
Yeah.
and like you said, Ken, you know, we're paying for our sins. You know, we think we all, you know, humankind knew best, and we're obviously being shown up, and nature is showing us why. Tell us, Ken, as well. Not only the IFI, there's also great data from Scotland as well. That's helping inform research.
Yeah, there's been some really special work done. So a chap that I know well in Scotland, a very brilliant scientist called Ian Malcolm. So Ian got his team on the job about 2016, 2017. And the reason that happened, you would think the last place in the world that would be affected by increasing temperatures would be the Highlands in Scotland. You would imagine that they were completely immune to any sort of impact. But what they were finding was, because of the way they're managed, and people go to Scotland, I hope the tourist board aren't listening, but they go to Scotland looking for wilderness, and they take all these pictures of the wilderness. The wilderness is created by man because of the management of the deer and the management of the grouse and the burning of the heather and the overgrazing by the deer. So that means that it's without trees to a very large extent. So in a situation where there was no trees and where there was sometimes very degraded heather, there was very little shade for some of these rivers. And because of the fact that they were extremely shallow and that they were facing in the west-southwest direction, they were extraordinarily exposed to temperature. And some of the gauges they had in some of their experimental streams, experimental in the sense that they were looking at salmon and trout in these streams, they were showing very high increases by 2016, high peaks. And he immediately said, "Oh, we have to start looking at this in detail." And they put together what they call the Scotland River Temperature Monitoring Network, and have had that in place and have published some extraordinary information as the temperatures increased. And then from that, a chap who works with me now in the Atlantic Salmon Trust, the CEO, Mark Spilsby. Mark, again, very early on, as CEO of the trust in the D, he said, "We have to do something about this." And they started a big campaign on the Upper D to start replanting trees. And people said, "You're absolutely mad.
That's right.
The estates won't let you do this." So he talked to the estates and he got really good support. And they had a lot of failures and now a lot of success, because they had to devise systems so that they could actually protect the young saplings. And to go up to the Upper D now and see what's happening in terms of not alone the shade, but the real significant decreases they're getting in terms of water temperatures, is a real lesson in terms of what needs to be done. But it takes a long number of years and it takes a lot of commitment. But I must say, I think the young scientists I mentioned earlier in IFI, I think they're very much on the ball now. I think they're on the game. They understand that these are the sort of things that we need that we need to be looking at. And certainly the data set and all of the lovely graphs that are available from the Scottish work, they're very impressive. And they would give you great hope that we can start to mitigate and manage these things. And just to bounce back, if I may, to the lakes, Tom, because I think it's an important point to make, that when we did our recent mayfly study, Martin McGarrigle, who's a very, very good scientist who worked for years with the EPA, Martin found when he looked at the temperature regime in the lakes that it's only now beginning to tick up. So it's only now beginning just to start to move. So there's nothing that dramatic happening in the lakes at the moment. That might be on the surface, but overall, it's only just starting. So now is the time to start thinking about what exactly we should be doing with the lakes and how we should be managing them. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, I don't mind mentioning it the second time, a lot of our sampling is excellent in our lakes, but it tends to be out in the centre. And certainly the lesson we learned was that it's a completely different world where Tom Dock has his boats. That is an absolutely completely different world to when you're out at the islands. And we need to be taking that into account. We won't have the resources to put people everywhere. But I think the anglers would really enjoy monitoring their own areas and monitoring their own bays and understanding what was happening. I think that could be really helpful to us in the future.
That'd be a nice program to start a kind of a citizen science and come up with some catchy name for it. But wouldn't it, to try and get anglers and clubs and associations involved on a regular basis to do it, like, and start building with this data set.
Yeah, we see that's the important thing, to build up the data. As you say, like Ken, a lot of them are, just out in the centre and things like that. But if you're doing it steadily and monitoring it all the time, it's only then when you can have comparisons that you can actually look at it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there's a very, very good study online called Rescale. And the climate scientists from Maynooth, they approached us in Burrishoole in the research station in Newport that I used to run about 2008 or so. And they wanted to look at what they called downscaling the climate models. And this was all kind of fairy tale stuff at the time. And what they wanted to do was look at the climate models and see if they could find one that would be suitable for a sink-day catchment. And the reason they picked us was because we have daily meteorological data since the 1950s. Because the Met Office built a Met station at the same time that the research station came into being. So we have a unique set of data across the world, never mind a unique set of data in Europe. And because we have so much information, they were able to simulate what would happen out to 2080. And if you look at that report, and I'll send the link for it to be put online. If you look at that report, you will see that the simulations were basically, they were telling us everything we know now in terms of the temperature regime and the droughts and so on. But interestingly, as far as I can see, in some of the parameters at least, we're outstretching what was simulated. It's actually, the increases are higher. The actual discharge patterns at times are really huge. There was one massive event in Burrishoole where 55 millimeters of rain, that's over 2 inches of rain, fell in 2 hours. And if I remember right, I think we lost 3 bridges and I think we had 4 landslides that night. So if there had been people there rather than sheep, there would have been people killed. That was extraordinary. And it was just whole mountains just moved. So the thing is that all of these things can be monitored locally. And as I say, we tend to just demand that our services would spread themselves thinner and thinner. But I think collectively we can do a lot more to try and look at these things. People are now so savvy in terms of their savvy with the IT and savvy in terms of the education they have, more than capable to do this. And my experience of 12 or 14 years of working with communities, there's a huge, huge hunger out there for people to get an opportunity to be able to help. And I think that should be taken advantage of.
I think that's a great initiative.
Yeah, great initiative. It'll be some project to get up off the ground. It really would. Yeah, because I think the interest is there locally. Let's say, for an example, with the community, with local angling clubs, and if there's procedures to be followed, as you say, Ken, we're all a lot more savvy now on working with things and collecting data, and if it's just a matter of monitoring a place and collecting the data, that's going to be, proper data.
What we've learned down the years is that there's a couple of different features. Exactly what you're saying, Tom, in combined with, there has to be some sort of quality control on the data. Not insulting anyone, but there has to be quality control for it to stand up in a scientific sense. It has to be put into a formal database. And that database, again, it has to be quality controlled, but also accessible to the powers that be. So I think they're the features that you have. Proper training where people would actually get some sort of certified training, that there be quality control, that the data would actually be properly handled, properly stored, and those data that are verified. And that's why I made the point that the 2023 data was verified. It wasn't just a set of numbers that they picked up and said, here's a couple of averages. It was actually verified data. Then people would take it serious. Then they look on it as data and they see it as real citizen science data. And I think we're we're basically talking tonight along the same lines as LawPro, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the LawPro are really keen that people would do this, and have rolled out a lot of programs in recent years to try and make sure that the funding and so on is made available for people to be able to do this sort of work.
Ken, I want to come on to the food sources for trout in a minute. But just, you mentioned, just kind of by way of passing, coarse fish. What effect does these increased temperatures have on coarse fish?
Well, again, going back to IFI, James Barry, a very keen angler that I'm sure most of us know, James produced a fantastic paper just a couple of years ago. And there's actually a diagram in that, and it shows very clearly the tolerance, if you like, of the different fish species. And it starts off then with some of the species that have been introduced. So fish like chub, which have been fortunately or unfortunately introduced into the River Inny. So starts off with chub, then it moves up through the cyprinids, through the rudd and the bream and so on, then up to the pike, and right up along then to the trout, and at the very top then are the char. And I've had some personal experience of rearing char and that in Burrishoe. Their sensitivity to temperature is just absolutely unbelievable. They just do not like temperatures much above about 10 or 12 degrees centigrade. That isn't what they live in.
Would that explain, Ken, then the reason that char are becoming a disappearing species?
As part of the mayfly study we did recently, Martin McGarrigle again made the point that the EPA feel that probably the reason it disappeared out of Con was probably to do with the pollution and the huge amount of filamentous algae that was on their spawning grounds. So it's probably more likely that they couldn't actually lay their eggs there. But that was, remember, that's a long time, that's decades ago, maybe in the late 80s, 90s. Whereas I think, yes, that it must put some of them under pressure. Great thing is that we don't have char in rivers, we have char in lakes. And I think if we look after our lakes, I think we have a much better chance of making sure that they're not a species that disappears. I think as well that we know this from the Wicklow Mountains and the disappearance of the char from Loch Dan, that if you have very, very heavy changes in terms of the very intensive changes, I should say, in terms of the land use around those lakes, in combination perhaps with those temperature rises, you could have a serious issue. And because of this new technique, it's not that new now, it's probably 10 years actually in management use, but I'm a great fan of what we call environmental DNA. So basically, any fish that's outside Tom's door there in Corrib, it's excreting, it's losing slime, it's losing scales, and everything it's losing is bringing its DNA with it. So we're now in a position where we can take water samples, and certainly the scientists who work in this area, and some really good scientists in UCD that are top of the game in this, they can actually give you a profile in terms of what species are present. So,
are you serious?
Absolutely.
Through a water sample?
Absolutely, through a water sample.
That's phenomenal.
Now they're using, some of my colleagues in Scotland are using the water sample technique to look at invertebrates. And the big stonefly perlet, the great big black one with the two big tails, that is particularly good in terms of eDNA, in terms of picking it up in an eDNA sample. So a couple of years ago, a colleague and myself, we put forward a proposal to get citizen scientists trained up to use very simple little water filters, so that they could filter a litre of water through a little cloth, that they would put over that. And through the filter paper then, they could actually filter the water. The sample would be in the filter paper, and you bottle up the filter paper and send it back to the scientists in UCD. Unfortunately, we didn't get funded. But I think that again is totally and completely open to citizen scientists with a little bit of training. And can you imagine the amount of interest there would be in that? And each year it's becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of its ability to pick up DNA.
I have so many questions on that.
I'm still agog. I wasn't aware of that at all, Ken.
I was sure you would be.
No, I wasn't.
But is that real? Can you do? Because I'm trying to remember. Was there something about this? Can this be done in the ocean, or has it been done?
Yes.
In the ocean?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a
So that
huge
you can
amount.
you can see where the salmon, if they were eating, where the spratted, all that kind of stuff is, what should be in the
Now
water column, is
it's
it?
very qualitative, and in
Mm.
the sense that it's picking up the DNA. But the question is, how did the DNA get there? So there was a colleague of mine had a great example where he was looking at this in Norway, and he was working on a ship, and out of nowhere, and he sent me an email to tell me this because he was so amused. Suddenly, Atlantic salmon appeared in his eDNA sample, and there was absolutely no way it could have been, because these were sort of bottom trawls and everything else. They couldn't have
Mm.
been. And the skipper had actually brought salmon sandwiches with him on board the ship, and his hands still had salmon DNA on it when he took the sample. He hadn't washed his hands. No. So I think that's a great example of being careful. And you have to be,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm always worried about people saying this is magic. It's not magic, but it's great. It's a great indicator, and then it has to be verified. But you have to wash your hands. That's the most
Tuna
important.
DNA, John West,
Yeah.
tuna
Yeah.
DNA.
There's tuna in the coral. I just spotted it in my DNA sample. But listen, there are so many questions there, but the one I have to ask now, how long does DNA last for?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think I'm no expert on that. The honest answer is I
Yeah.
don't know. I would imagine that it will degrade over time, and that if it's a small source of DNA, that will only be there in a fleeting way. Whereas if you have a big concentration, and increasingly they're thinking, how do we quantify this? How do we get some idea of the amount of DNA that's there? And I think they're getting much closer to that now. And actually had a conversation with someone the other day, and they were talking about very strong eDNA signals. So at least they're qualitatively able to say whether it's a weak signal, i.e., it's the sandwich, or it's a very strong signal, which would indicate that the fish may very well be there. We used that technique to look at the scat of birds a couple of years ago in Scotland. So we had the unenviable task of going out and taking samples from bird poo, which we tested out on the Boyne, and we had some very peculiar looks as we went around dipping our little probes into the poo. But it was revealing in terms of what the birds were feeding on, and very different to what you would imagine. So there was one set of gooseanders that we looked at, and it was during the smolt run, and predominantly they were feeding on sticklebacks. And probably the reason was that the sticklebacks were spawning at the time, and the concentration of smolts just wasn't big enough to divert them away from the sticklebacks. But I'm sure every angler sitting on the bank would have sworn that they were feeding completely on salmon parr.
Tell us this, Ken, because we mentioned the food there. What's the potential impact of the increased water temperature on food sources?
Yeah, I think that's the one I'm really interested in. As I mentioned earlier, some of our invertebrates may very well turn out to be invertebrates that are very much invertebrates that would have naturally come from a cold water environment, so they'll be cold water sensitive. At the moment, I just don't know which they might be, but I think that's the sort of area we should be looking at. Certainly, I think that as our plant species, as they move and as they increase across the bed of our lakes, and what we're seeing at the moment, we have some at least the beginnings of some nice evidence to show that in very clear lakes, in certain bays, we're actually seeing a much more dense concentration of certain plant species than we would have seen in the past. Now, just to be clear, these aren't invasive. These are completely natural plants, which are just spreading because conditions suit them well. So as those plants change, for example, if you get a lot of plants that gather very fine silt at their roots, you may very well find that will then exclude the mayfly because it can't build its burrows, but the number of buzzer will actually increase significantly in those areas. And it may be very species specific in terms of the buzzers that may come in. It may not be the buzzer that we're used to in terms of the duckfly, which usually occurs in quite deep parts of the lake. Maybe a different sort of buzzer, one that's quite natural, but again, it gets this opportunity to increase. I think as well, because of the large number of sedges that we have, the sedges obviously are very happy in some of the dense plant and vegetation that we have around the shallow areas of the lakes. And again, these may change. And again, this is an area, I know I'm banging on about this, but I really feel that it is an area where anglers could really start educating themselves and the rest of us in terms of the changes that are happening and in terms of the species that may be occurring. And mostly we tend to just look at the larvae and we tend to look at the nymphs, because that's traditionally the way you did sampling on a river, looking at water quality. But Dick Harris, who wrote that fantastic book, An Angler's Entomology, Dick helped me with my PhD, and I had great times with him for about 8 or 10 years, got to know him really well. He was the most amazing expert on adults, and particularly adult Ephemeroptera, adult mayflies. And by the flying pattern of a spinner, he could tell you what species it was. And it was just amazing, the knowledge that he had. And to a large extent, I think that has slumped. I don't hear the anglers talking much more about trying to identify the individual adults. They'll stick on a general imitation for an adult, and they'll guess that maybe it's a BWO or something, stick on a general imitation, where he was very keen on the kind of flight pattern, and most importantly, how they laid the eggs, where they laid the eggs, and how they died on the water. That would then indicate what way the fish were feeding. So if we see a lot of changes in sedges, we might very well see sedge patterns that are quite different to the sedge patterns that were patterns of hatching that we're seeing now. And that may mean that we as anglers will have to produce new patterns and new ways of approaching that. But again, what I was trying to encourage Kilkenny was to be ahead of the posse. Try and think about this and see if you're seeing things that are different, and see how you can tie that in with the changes that you are seeing.
Does that mean potentially, like in 15, 20 years' time, what we knew as the kind of traditional hatches at different times of the year could be, well, maybe not obsolete, but could be radically different? Like if you had a chart now to a chart in 15, 20 years' time, it could be quite different.
Well, certainly the article I did for Trout and Salmon a few weeks ago on the mayfly showed very clearly that was definitely the case. That in the case of the big mayfly, Ephemera danica, there was definitely a tendency in the Midlands now for it to be available, as it is in the West very often, right the way from April to August. So that tendency was increasing. The length frequency, the actual distribution of the sizes of the nymphs changed substantially to when I looked at them for my PhD. And the pattern was much more similar between the Midlands and the West than it had been in the past. So when I went to Lough Cara in the past, this would have been in the late 70s, you had this huge array of different sizes of nymphs because it was so mild and because conditions were so suitable in the lake. You got mayflies hatching all the time, right through from March right up to October. And you were getting some flies that were mating, getting some eggs that were actually laid. And I was able to show that some of these, if you got conditions perfectly right, some of these adults were only 9 months old when they actually finally hatched, particularly the males.
Wow.
And some of them then were 2 years. And some of the big mayflies that we got in the rivers, are mad to go back and have a look at rivers again. And we were getting consistently big mayfly nymphs of 40 to 42 millimeters in the rivers. Some of those might very well have been 3 years. So again, they're plastic. They're going to change with the conditions. And I think that's going to actually mimic exactly what's going to happen with the other species in terms of the pattern of hatches and the intensity in terms of the pattern of hatches. For instance, the duckfly might very well be something that might appear before the trout season actually starts in the future. If the lakes really do change, they're only changing, as I said earlier, very slowly. But that's something that could happen. And it wouldn't be that they've disappeared. It would be that the phenology, the actual sequencing of their hatch may have changed. And this is all surmise at the moment, but that's what I think we should be thinking about and monitoring. But I think it offers all sorts of interesting opportunity to anglers. The other thing that I think is really interesting is fry. And I think we have to, I know Tom was looking up to the sky the last time I fished with him when I decided there was no fish there and I started to fish my lures. But I'm very interested in he was offended. He was definitely
not. I'm just sorry. I couldn't do it. No. I'm a great believer in that. I mean,
he's a convert now, Ken.
He's a convert. Trying to pretend he was all right. I'm only joking. But I think
might I add? You said you go salmon fishing during a drought. You go mayfly fishing during a drought as well. If
absolutely, I do. Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I specialize in trouts, but certainly I think we need to watch those fry, because I think we're going to see quite major changes. I mean, if you look what's happening with the dace in the rivers, where we go to the shore now. The shore had no dace 20 odd years ago. And the numbers of dace that are there, both in terms of predatory birds, and they may be shielding the trout, and in terms of the trout themselves, there may be fairly significant changes in terms of the feeding patterns of the fish and how they're actually going to approach not just the fry, but the bigger stages of the fish may become very important if some of the key species that we would have, inverted commas, depended on in the past have diminished in terms of numbers. And how the actual coarse fish and the hybrids, how they adapt and how they change as a result of any changes that we might see. I think it's all to play for, really.
Well, I think what has happened to fry fishing here, I say fry fishing and not fly fishing, is a case in point of what you're saying, Ken, because, I mean, the last couple of years here, I mean, from July onwards, if you're not prepared to do a bit of um, lure imitation,
Yeah,
coarse fry imitation,
yeah,
you're losing out because
yeah, yeah,
they have switched to it. They it's a major part of their diet at that period of the season now, and you have to be prepared to put it. I mean, for example, I mean, I have a lot of small little patterns that I really like. I use a lot of small minkies, but one of the most popular flies of the last couple of years from July onwards is a silver dabbler.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
why are they taking that?
Hello, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
you know,
yeah. No, I think that's certainly something that's coming down the tracks for us, and also the location of these. Where are they going to be in the future?
Mm.
What are they themselves feeding on? So there's a colleague of mine now who's actually looking at the food of some of the smaller creatures that the young salmon feed on when they go to sea, and they've realized that perhaps it's the food of the actual food that's important. And it might seem as if this is nonsense because it's so tiny, but it really is important in terms of that whole pyramid that we're talking
Yeah.
about, in terms of what comes up. The apex, of course, would be the trout for us, but what comes
Mm.
up through that apex and how it's changing and how it's moving. The other thing that I banged on about a little bit, which I think is interesting for me, I worked for about 10 years. I was really privileged to work for about 10 years in the Marine Institute. And of course, it gave me a whole new view of life. Having had mostly a freshwater background, I've always had a bit of involvement with the marine side, but that 10 years in the Marine Institute was a revelation, working with these very, very gifted people. And at that stage, they were just beginning to think about ecosystem management. They were just beginning to see, how do you actually start thinking about the full ecosystem? Now, let's just imagine 44,000 acres of Loch Corrib. That's a good bay. It's a big bay in the sea. How do you start thinking about everything? So stand back from it and don't jump in and say, I'm going to look at the trout. I'm going to look at the invasive species. I'm going to look at the plants. How do you start thinking about that? And it seems as if it's just not possible. But they've actually developed a science now of ecosystem management in the ocean that is really very sophisticated. They're still learning. They're still tweaking it. The whole approach is completely different to the way we do our freshwater biology. And there's a couple of people in the Marine Institute, I won't mention their names for fear of embarrassing them, but there's a couple of people in the Marine Institute that are world class at this. So I gave a talk at the Water Forum recently, and I encouraged the Water Forum to start thinking about this. And I asked them, had they ever had a meeting with the Marine Institute? Of course they didn't. And I said, would you not think about that? Because we need to learn how people actually are managing this in the context of the big dollop of water that's out there in terms of the marine and the estuaries. And I think that's a very exciting area, is the idea of actually looking at these food chains and food webs. And it goes to the very heart of what we've been speaking about, that you have to try and challenge yourself to think about the interactions. And I made one point there earlier that I just glossed over. This whole idea, for example, of invasive species in a river. If you have enough of those small species or fry or small juveniles of those fish to attract the predators, they may act as a mask for the trout. It may actually be that the cormorants and so on that you're so worried about in the past, that they are now predominantly feeding on the invasive species, reducing their numbers, reducing the impact they're having on the invertebrates, and actually helping the trout and the salmon. So we have to be conscious that these changes are happening. And we won't know these changes are happening if we keep just zeroing in on one tiny aspect of it. at least a couple of people in any team have to be given the freedom to think about the ecosystem and think about the food webs. And certainly when you see them, when you see the spider webs and so on at scientific meetings, it looks as if it's totally academic. To me, it is really, really important to try and understand how these things are changing. Or else, again, I think we'll get caught out.
The other thing on that as well, though, Ken, isn't it? And, like you said, about, say, the cormorants and the predators and the masking it for the trout, is unintended consequences for a lot of this. And what I'm thinking here is that example in Canada where the striper bass have exploded, so much so to the detriment of the salmon. And they've got a real problem there now, don't they? Because of it, because the bass are moving north,
more north
for the warmer waters, but they're also being more protected, aren't they? So as a result, they're now outnumbering the salmon.
So the numbers, I'm smiling because I just had an email from my friend in Canada who's very concerned about this just this afternoon. The numbers involved in the Miramichi are absolutely astronomical. They're colossal. So some of my colleagues who were at the Big Salmon meeting NASCO last year in Miramichi in Canada decided to go striped bass fishing. And they gave up on it after 2 days. They were catching so many fish. They ran out of sport, if you like, in the sense it was just too easy and there was too many fish there. And that's more than likely, they haven't actually identified it, but it seems fairly obvious that it's more than likely to do with changes that are linked in with ocean changes, which are probably linked in again with everything we've been talking about this evening. But I think we're seeing those changes. You know that yourself, Dara, fishing along the south coast with Jason and so on, with the huge numbers of golden grey mullet that we now have, the thin lip mullet, these huge increases in bass. And the shoals of bass, I'm sure you saw some of the videos that were produced over May. The shoals of bass that moved inshore at that stage were very significant indeed. But in October last year, and I'm no bass angler, but I was down with a friend of mine last year and we actually lost count of the number of bass we caught. And again, most of them were those schoolies, not quite as small as the ones Jason's seeing at the moment. But remember, the bass are very slow growing, but these are fantastic year classes. So because they're slow growing, those year classes are going to last way into, way into the next decade or more. And we've seen some such significant changes in the ocean. And again, we had another marine heat wave in May, with the temperatures there going up in the south in particular, going up by more than 4 degrees. That's the whole ocean going up by 4 degrees. This is huge stuff.
And do you put those bass numbers down to that heat wave, Ken?
I think not just one heat wave, but I think what's happening is, just to go back a step, there was a guy called Michael Kennedy, who was a very famous Irish biologist, and he had a real interest in bass. And he wrote this fantastic seminal paper on bass, where they spawn, growth rates, and everything else with Paddy Fitzmaurice, my ex-boss. And in that, they keep quoting the 1959 year class. And my dad had to go and work in London for 3 years. And he was trying to convince my mother that we should all go over and live in London. I'd be speaking to you with a Cockney accent if it come through. So he brought us over for 4 months in 1959. And it was the warmest year for decades and decades and decades, 1959. We went over in May and came back in October. And of course, we were very little. But my mum, Lord rest her, used to tell us we were right in our memory of nothing but sunshine that whole summer. But that year class lasted for over 20 years, that bass year class. And yet, at that time, according to Michael Kennedy's paper, it was only 1 year and 6, 1 year and 7 that you would see a strong year class, because we were at the very limit of the distribution of the bass. So what I think is happening now is that we're seeing consistently good years of recruitment. I'm only guessing at this. But if you look at 2018 was a warm year. 2023 was a warm year. So we seem to be in a situation where, and again, if they're out there as they probably were in March, April, May this year, where we're seeing a consistent recruitment of the bass coming in. And something is drawing in those golden grey mullet as well. Something is drawing in the thin lip mullet, and something is bringing in the triggerfish. So it's not just the fresh, it's the whole aquatic environment really that's changing.
Exactly, and that comes back to your point about it's the whole ecosystem that we need to be looking at. Whether it's trout and what they're feeding on, and the hatches and how that's going to be changing. And I bring it back to that as well, the unintended consequences as well. Because if you talk to a saltwater angler, they're loving this. They're like, bring on the
Yeah.
heat, bring on the climate change. And that's the scary thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like,
cheers.
so just in relation to that, Ken, I suppose the adaptability of species. Can we kind of guess at that in terms of? I know talking to you before, Ken, you're saying the salmon, we're seeing them go further north, obviously, because they're looking for colder water. What about brown trout in rivers and lakes? How will they adapt?
We don't know really, but
Yeah.
the one thing we do know about trout is they are one of the most invasive species in the world because of their adaptability. When you think about the situation where they brought brown trout down to Argentina, they brought brown trout to the Falklands, they brought brown trout then to New Zealand, and they all ended up becoming sea trout. So they have huge adaptability and they are well able to adapt. We also have some very good indications as well. I mean, the experience we had with the mayflies where we found that they were using the empty shells and zebra mussels instead of making burrows. I mean, that was fantastic to find. That was so exciting to find that. And then we found in Lough Conn that they were living in this area where there was hard nodules of peat that had come down the Deal River. And they were quite happy making a home there. So, I mean, I think nature is fantastic. We all know it is because we're so close to it as anglers. I think it'll adapt.
Thinking of the natural range of brown trout in Europe, okay? So the southernmost range, and it's actually not in Europe, they're in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco.
Yeah.
Are they still surviving there?
Yeah, well, that's a really, really good point because I don't know the answer to that, but there are some indications at the moment. First of all, in terms of chalk streams, there was a big study done on salmon in chalk streams. And the salmon in the chalk streams are genetically so distinct, it's unreal. So they have adapted to the conditions, the kind of constant temperature conditions that are in those chalk streams. Also, we have a situation where they're looking at the moment at the salmon and trout populations in Spain and Portugal to look at that very fact as to whether or not they have, over the generations, adapted genetically to those particular conditions. So even in absolute worst case scenario, when we're all long gone, if Lough Conn was really, really, really suffering, we should be looking at this stage at what the Norwegians did. We should be looking at gene banking, and we should be looking as well at testing other populations of fish. Not that you would stop them, but you would look at them in the context of the conditions that you're expecting to see if those more adaptable strains are the ones that really need to be gently introduced if the unimaginable happens in 80 years' time. But I think those are the sort of features that, to us as anglers, that are really, really important. But our creatures, they're just so amazing in terms of what they can do in situations where you would imagine that they'd be completely and totally on their knees. The worst thing that we can do, I know I bang on all the time about the drainage, but not just the drainage, but the drainage and the pollution to damage the actual infrastructure of those biological communities. That's the death knell. The communities themselves, there was a lot of, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there was probably a lot of adaptability built into the environments that they lived in. The natural structure of a river, all of those little nooks and crannies, all of the trees that would have fallen in and provided that shade and provided those little pools, the adaptability that was there in terms of the lakes. So the more we challenge that by putting in pollution, by making sure then that these very deep water areas that would remain cool, if they're getting a big pile of decomposing algae from the surface coming down there, that's going to soak up all the oxygen that's in that lower layer. So these things are real challenges, I think, for the fish.
Actually, and you just mentioned there was a question I wanted to ask you at the start. So as a scientist, is it that when the temperature of water increases, does the level of dissolved oxygen decrease? And is that the reason why salmonoids don't like high temperature, or is it another reason?
Well, I think that the oxygen levels are absolutely critical. I had that in my notes to mention, Tom. I'm glad you reminded me of it, because I'll give you a very good example of something that seems absolutely logical. So I'm lucky enough to fish from time to time in Montana. And they brought in a system whereby if the water temperature got to about 67 Fahrenheit, roughly kind of 18 degrees, you stopped fishing during the day. But then you had this kind of hoot owl fishing. So you could start fishing at 11 o'clock in the evening and you fished away when it was cool at night. But when you think about it, that's the very time when the plants are beginning to release carbon dioxide and when the oxygen levels are are decreasing rather, and stressing the fish. So in terms of catch and release in the middle of the night is probably not the best thing to do at all if your oxygen levels are under stress. Yeah. And it's the dynamic between the two. We're going to end up, guys, with nobody going fishing again. You know that.
Well, yeah, don't mention that one now, Ken. That's definitely one for another day. Can I ask you just, and it might be a complete oversimplification, or I might be completely wrong in this, in terms of the southern climate, Spain, Italy, for example, Portugal, trout numbers are much reduced. Am I right in those areas?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, certainly the areas I know best now would be Slovenia and Croatia, and certainly that's not the case in Slovenia or Croatia. And they could be super warm at times. A lot of their rivers are spring fed, though. Remember what I was saying about the spring fed rivers? So you have to compare like with like, but certainly they're very healthy now at this stage.
So looking into the crystal ball, Ken, as we kind of wrap up. Actually, I don't think I want to look into the crystal.
No. Bad job, Darren.
I think I just put head in the sand. That's the best. Be like the rest of human nature. Let's pretend it's not happening. You know, the fish are going to adapt. Like 15, 20 years time, are we going to be fishing more for saltwater? You know, i.e. bass, mullet. The ecosystems are changing, so therefore, you know, what's hatching, you know, the preponderance of fry, how we fish for trout. The trout numbers might be less because there's only certain ecosystems where they'll actually be surviving. It's fairly apocalyptic.
I don't think it is. And I know it may run contrary to what I was saying earlier, just giving you indications of the challenges. And I think we should look on these things as challenges. It's not by any means the end. The first thing is exactly what you said and what we've been talking about, the adaptability of these creatures. They may not be in the numbers and in the places we want them, but they will be in numbers and in places where they haven't been before, because that's the way adaptation works. I think what we'll have in the future is I have great hope for the lakes, because I think at this stage we have seen what we have done to the rivers. There's no hope for any of us on the island if we don't actually learn from what we've done from the rivers. Having done what we've done to the rivers, and people are well aware now of the challenges that are facing the lakes, I really do think that we can learn as anglers to fish in sequence with the various fish species and the times of the year. So, for example, I think we'll continue to enjoy our spring fishing. I think we'll continue to enjoy, hopefully, our mayfly fishing. I think once you get to June, July, and August, that may be a real challenge. And I think people need to buy a bit of sea gear and start thinking about going and doing some fly fishing in the ocean, which you and I know is absolutely fantastic fun. And they would only do that in conditions where either because of regulation, maybe temperatures are so high that rivers are closed, but they may choose to do that as well because of the issues with catch and release and so on. And then you're back into the autumn again. We also have a fantastic variety of fish species. So I enjoy fishing for everything. I love fish. I love my pike fishing in particular. So at the end of the day, we have the opportunity, I think, to fish for the whole year. But I think we really have to understand that the way we fish and the times we fish may change. And I think in conditions where there's big challenges, we have to think about the welfare of the fish. And I think the whole question of really good handling and catch and release is really going to come to the fore. And I think we have to think about a situation where we're not taking fish out of the water at all, but where we're actually doing what they've done for many years in Alaska and shaking the leader. Because I think that may be the only way to deal with marginal situations where the temperature is just about at the point where fishing is a no-go.
I'm banking on the AMOC, because one of the studies that breaks down our climate will be like Scandinavia.
Yeah, some of my oceanographic friends don't think that's going to happen at all. So they're quite convinced it's not. But at the same time, who knows? I mean,
Exactly.
everything is changing. Everything is changing so fast. But I think if there's a theme, if I might suggest for this evening, it's just be aware and be adaptable. Because the honest truth is that nobody has a crystal ball. But we do know how fast everything has changed in the last decade. And I think that's the only way we can move forward.
Well, Ken, thank God we have you here to join all the dots and, at least maybe point in the direction for the future for where people need to be thinking at the very least, and, spurring people into action and thought as well. So I really appreciate it, Ken. As always, it's been absolutely brilliant chatting to you. I'd love to catch up again next year when we're another 2 degrees hotter or whatever the hell it is. Because I have a feeling this is just going to fast forward whatever it is. I think, like you said, I think we're underestimating the rate of change and what is happening. And we'll see. But Ken, thanks a million for joining us.
Not at all, my pleasure.
Our thanks to Ken for joining us on the show. And don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.